Well, I'm now joined by Professor Adekeye Adebajo, a senior research fellow at the University of Pretoria's Center for the Advancement of Scholarship in South Africa. Also joining me is Dr. Lebohang Pheko, a senior research fellow at the Trade Collective. A very good afternoon to both of you. Thank you very much for your time. I want to start with you, Dr. Pheko, if you don't mind. Bruce Spector, a retired diplomat, says, forget about everything else. Cyril Ramaphosa, focus on trade. Do you think that's possible?
Not in an atmosphere where we realize, Vuyo, that trade is actually a feature of relationships. It's deeply relational. And this idea that we can divorce the economy and the geopoliticization of the economy and trade relations from politics and from other relationships, from cordiality, is a fallacy. And it's this neoliberal idea that trade happens in abstraction. It's actually the result of shared mutual interests, tough and rough negotiations. Of course, every country has its own interests. Every region has its own interests as well. And also, we are seeing a real rise in multilateralism and multipolarism, which is why you have formations like the African Union, like the European Union, like the BRICS, and so on. Because where your power as a nation alone is perhaps not sufficient, or perhaps is seen as not as sufficient as it could be in a community with others, then aggregated power is the way to go. But this notion that trade happens in isolation somewhere on a planet somewhere is really not true.
And Prof. Adebajo, the reason I was kicking off with that question is precisely because literally, last night, our time, you had Marco Rubio, telling the world, in fact, literally telling us what the agenda is, saying we've got to discuss geopolitics.
Yes, good afternoon to you and your listeners. I think it's important to note that Bruce Spector was not just a retired diplomat, but a retired US diplomat in South Africa. So it's important to put that on the table. I don't think it's possible either to focus on just the trade issue, because in the end, the problems in this bilateral relationship are political and not economic ones. So those issues need to be resolved. And those issues revolve around, according to the Trump administration, South Africa's what has been described very histrionically as white genocide, and Afrikaner farmers feeling threatened. And so the Trump administration offering refuge to them, which we saw 49 or so people accept about a week ago, and 8,200 people have applied for that program. And also, South Africa is chairing the group of 20 most industrialized countries, and within that forum, the US has boycotted both meetings. Its Secretary of State and Secretary of Treasury have not turned up, and President Trump is also saying he's unlikely to come to the summit in November. But at the heart of all of this is actually the diplomatic shadowboxing and this phony war. Is South Africa, having taken Israel to the International Court of Justice on charges of genocide, is really what most people feel is at the crux of these issues. So just focusing on trade seems to me a bit fanciful.
And of course, Dr. Pheko, not only is Marco Rubio the one who boycotted the first G20 international relation ministers meeting that took place here in February. After Trump, he is probably the most outspoken and vociferous anti-South Africa voice.
He certainly is. I think we saw him defending the the refugees, the Afrikaner dissidents, I think I'd rather call them, just yesterday, and stating that the logic for this really literally color-coded acceptance of these 49 white Afrikaners at a time when, of course, thousands of Palestinians, Syrians, Afghans, Nigerians, Congolese, and country and other people who have applied have been declined any form of solace in the United States. We're also aware of the combative border relations historically between the United States and their neighbors, particularly Mexico. And we're also aware, of course, of the really human rights brutalities, including children being imprisoned at border camps, often without their parents. And I mean, what Rubio has done is, of course, to defend the Trump administration's decision. He's been one of the most vociferous peddlers of the complete fallacy, of the complete untruth of genocide, doubling down, in fact, under scrutiny and under interrogation, as it were, and stating that these refugees, in inverted commas, pass every test. And they've passed every test there is. He doesn't state what this test is, and how they've verified this refugee status, and that these people, most of whom we now know are not even farmers, some of whom really don't seem to have any other sources of economic, to be of any economic benefit in terms of scarce skills that the American economy wants to, let alone agricultural ones. I think another thing is that he's been, of course, very, very critical of our domestic and foreign policy, especially regarding land reform and our international alignments. So he too has been very critical of South Africa's positioning within the BRICS formation, and he too has tried to bully essentially the South African government and pick us out of all the other BRICS nations, in order to then seemingly bend to their will. And I think one can sort of see the geopolitical racism in this, because certainly Russia and China and India, who are also part of the BRICS, are not being subjected to any of this nonsense.
And the reason I was putting or kicked off this conversation around the comments made by Marco Rubio over the past 24 hours, Professor Adebajo, is because not only is it the latest information to come directly from someone who is not only close to Donald Trump in thinking, but in a whole lot of other things, but it's also because he is both the minister responsible for international relations in our parlance, but also the President Trump's advisor on intelligence. And he said something that was quite interesting for me, because I think it's something some of us take for granted, which is what, it's not just about the US being allies of Israel, but there are very real fears that the people, the Americans who are working closely with the Israelis may be affected by what may come out of that ICJ process that South Africa is championing.
So what's your question, Vuyo? Vuyo, what's the question you would like
I was saying, Prof, in the comments that Marco Rubio made, he spoke about how America and South Africa are unaligned, and how their fear is real, that the process, the ICJ process, may in fact affect a lot of Americans who could be jailed or indicted as part of that ICJ process, of which South Africa has taken a lead. In which, rather?
Yeah, the US is not a part of it's not a signatory to the international, it is part of the ICJ, but it's the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which the US is not part of, that would be doing the indicting. So the International Court of Justice is an advisory court for the United Nations and one of its main organs. So it doesn't indict people, but it can offer an advisory opinion that Israel is committing genocide, and then the United Nations Security Council would have to make a decision on what to do. But of course, the US, which is Israel's strongest ally, has a veto within the UN Security Council, and so would prevent any action against Israel at the UN Security Council. But it would be very politically damaging for both Israel and indirectly the US if such a finding were to come out of the ICJ. So that's how I think I would address that. It's more the International Criminal Court, which is also based at The Hague, which would have to do any indicting. And you will remember that the International Criminal Court, in fact, has already recommended that Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, and his former defense minister have been recommended to be charged for war crimes over the Gaza situation.
Now, Dr. Pheko, the trade negotiations, where do you reckon that conversation is going to, in other words, beyond the geopolitics issues that we've been talking about up until now, where do you reckon that particular conversation on trade relations between the two countries will begin? Please unmute.
My apologies. They certainly want to go beyond they want to sort of like focus on the economic implications and move, I think, away from Musk's assertions, Elon Musk's assertions, wrongful, of course, that BEE has been deterring foreign investors, and that South Africa's regulatory environment is making it a pariah state. I mean, this is the sort of inflammatory language that we've been seeing over particularly the last 72 hours in some of the European and North American media. The US has also expressed its own concerns over some of South Africa's policies, and these include our own prioritization of trying to ensure that the people who have been previously disadvantaged and still dispossessed in the economy are able to then begin to build some intergenerational traction. And this also includes, our ownership quotas and the requirement for African-led and women-held companies as well. And they're also very interested in infrastructure development. Now, this offering, ostensibly, of this peace offering on a platter of Starlink and this work around BE requirements, I think is incredibly problematic. And I would, if I were them, I would strongly suggest that the South African delegation focus and hone in more on some of the World Trade Organization remits. And these really include questions around things like non-tariff barriers, which, by the way, the Trump administration is absolutely in violation of. It also has meant, one of the other requirements of the WTO is to ensure that there's predictability in trade relations. Now, this sort of way that we've seen the Trump administration using extremely arbitrary and weaponizing these tariff mechanisms has been in a way that's unilateral, is also very problematic. And some commentators have said that any country can do the same. Any country can use tariffs and use them to protect their own industry. And yes, to some extent, I think Kenya has done so in the past with their flour industry. I think some of the West African countries, Mali and Togo come to mind, have done so over their cotton industry in the past. At some point, Ethiopia also has done so over their lentils and their wheat industry. And of course, we're also aware that South Africa, we have an inbuilt tariff binding over our wheat industry here. But the distinction between this is that this is not a weapon. We are not pointing these tariffs outwards and using them as a conditionality to do trade. So I would strongly suggest that the South African delegation needs to use the World Trade Organization mechanism. I am no great fan of the WTO, by the way, because I think that in terms of its own power relations, it has always favored the US. It has always favored a few key European countries plus Japan. But at a time such as as this, what it has done is to try to provide a level of uniformity, of predictability, and of stability, none of which we are seeing during these strange times of very maverick and very weaponized trade relations. To go back to your first question, that is that trade is by no means neutral territory.
But then, Prof, knowing or having seen who the South African delegation would be dealing with here, do you think they will even be remotely prepared or ready to actually accept that these are negotiations and you're not about to shout orders or sign executive orders here?
I think it's important to look at this within Donald Trump himself. He's an extremely unusual individual. During his first term, between 2017 and 2020, he described African countries as shitholes. He also seems to have taken an axe to the multilateral trading system, as we've just heard, and he's withdrawn the US from the World Health Organization, from the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015. He's just enacted the most sweeping tariffs that we've seen in 90 years. And at home, Donald Trump is also doing things that are very divisive, I think, and quite nativist. You'll remember the Muslim ban from the first term. And in this particular term, so far, we don't see a very diverse cabinet at all for one of the first times in US history. And Trump has been attacking diversity, equality, and inclusivity programs, affirmative action and corrective measures from the past. So you have to set whatever is going to happen within this context. It's almost as if Trump is operating in a parallel universe. He knows very well that there is no genocide going on in South Africa, that South Africa has one of the most robust constitutions in the world, and that government has judicial review and checks and balances that even the government tends to lose a lot of cases in court. So South Africa's judiciary is strong, it's independent, it's robust, and Trump has access to the best intelligence in the world. The US's intelligence agencies can get any information that he needs. He has people on the ground here in the US Embassy, and he has people at the State Department, many of whom are very capable. So the issues that Trump seems to be using to beat South Africa over the head do not appear to be issues that South Africa can necessarily do something about. And we also mustn't forget that Trump is head of a MAGA, a Make America Great Again movement that is trying to basically, in my view, install a white supremacist regime. So there's a white replacement theory, which many of them believe whites are going to become a minority in the USA in 2 decades, and Hispanics and blacks and other minorities who are thought to be more friendly to the Democrats are going to be a majority. So what better way to try to maintain a white majority population than to bring what are considered Afrikaners, who were the pioneers of the apartheid system, to basically come to America as voters. But of course, they're not coming in large enough numbers. So it's also a symbolic gesture to that ideology.
Well, Dr. Pheko, you were talking earlier about the tariff barriers. Our regulatory environment, ownership quotas, but also, of course, raising the issue of tariff barriers that Trump, there's still that 90 day window within which people have to say, hey, how do you propose we deal with these issues? Now, right in the middle of that, or when you're dealing with all these big picture issues with the environment, the kind of an ideal environment, or what should be an ideal environment for trade between these two countries. Then come South African-born billionaire keen to pursue business interests in this country, and in this case, in the form of his Starlink. He wants something out, and this is a moment he is no doubt going to use to get what he wants.
You know, you raised something very important, Vuyo, and I think, you know, just by a precursor and kind of to also link to the previous remarks is this presence of this cabal, if as it were, of former white South Africans, some of whom very disgruntled. So Elon Musk is the most prominent, but also David Sachs, who's also a tech entrepreneur and also, you know, one of the PayPal and alumni with Elon Musk. There's Joel Pollak, as we know, who was born in Johannesburg and once worked for the Democratic Alliance, if I'm not mistaken. And then there's also Peter Thiel, who's German-born, but I mean, he essentially was raised in Namibia, in a place called Swakopmund, and I think that place is particularly notorious as being one of the places where people were still wearing Nazi regalia, and that it was not illegal to evoke, you know, Nazi salutes. Now, to also loop back to Elon Musk's own pedigree in this regard. His grandfather, his maternal grandfather, Joshua Heidelman, who was a Canadian, a chiropractor, who came to South Africa because he was actually incredibly compelled. He found the apartheid racial, the racial colonial apartheid regime incredibly compelling. And although there's no evidence that he was a member of the Nazi party per se, his documented political activities do seem to reflect a pattern of extremism. And his own son, Errol Musk, who is no great guy himself, has said that he has described his parents as being very fanatical in favor of apartheid. So I think that we should also view, you know, I don't think we should presume that because Elon Musk was raised in a different context, that perhaps he hasn't imbibed some of the same ideation, oddly enough. But I think to go to your point on Starlink, even though it has been said that it offers these benefits to bridge the digital divide, that it can create an integrative integration into our telecoms, and that, of course, it could potentially bring a whole new generation of data usage and data availability to us. This really comes off the back of many, many years and decades of local entrepreneurs and our own Department of Communications and Telecoms, who have been battling with the idea of the digital divide. Now, if there are two things here that come to mind. The one is this circumvention of the BEE, and as already been said, this is not surprising because of this dismantling of corrective measures that's taking place in the U.S., which is basically the attempt to disappear of Black and brown people, right? This idea of a false meritocracy and this lie that the world is flat and neutral and that there's no racism and that everybody gets an equal chance, which we know to be completely false. The other problem with this, of course, is that we have tech entrepreneurs on this continent who have been trying. I mean, we even have our own Strive Masiwas right here next door. There are people on the continent who have the capacity to provide this for far less. I think another concern is that the ICASA has not yet ratified the Starlink's deal, but it's far more expensive than any of the comparable infrastructure that other entrepreneurs and even as the state the state can offer South Africans and to give them the digital access that they need. And I just think it reads incredibly badly that people who have made all sorts of inflammatory claims, and are then being almost offered this peace offering. if there is indeed a genocide taking place in this country, why would Elon Musk want to do business with genocideers? It just begs the question. None of this makes sense. None of this, in my view, is also, I think that the other point about this is that even though it has been said that this is about the Israeli, our stand against the Israeli regime, even there, we have to remember that South Africa has been doing business with Israel. So this idea that South Africa is certainly legally has taken a moral stand, but regrettably, we also have been acting with a forked tongue in this regard. And lastly, to say that the United States has done business with atrocious regimes, I won't name them, but with atrocious regimes which don't respect human rights in any way, which don't respect labor rights, which don't respect environmental rights. They have had a penchant for doing business with all kinds of crackerjack authoritarians over the decades. And so we can see even through this historically that the geohistory and the geoeconomics of this moment are not founded on anything other than fiction and racial superiority.
In fact, elsewhere in the world, Dr. Pheko, among the reasons that certain countries have rejected Starlink have been on environmental grounds. But Professor Adebajo, Elon Musk maintains that his company, Starlink, or the only reason is being denied a license in South Africa is because he's not black. Take a listen to what he had. I mean, he had to say only yesterday.
Bloomberg broke news today that the South African government is working around the rules on black ownership in order to allow Starlink in, and that is being done on the eve of the visit that President Ramaphosa is going to make to the White House. Do you recognize that as a conflict of interest?
No, of course not. First of all, you should be questioning why are there racist laws in South Africa? That's the first problem. That's what you should be attacking. It's improper for there to be racist laws in South Africa. The whole idea with what Nelson Mandela, who was a great man, proposed was that all races should be on an equal footing in South Africa. That's the right thing to do, not to replace one set of racist laws with another set of racist laws, which is utterly wrong and improper. So that's the deal, that all races should be treated equally, and there should be no preference given to one or the other. Whereas there are now 140 laws in South Africa that give that basically give strong preference to if you're a black South African and not otherwise. And so now I'm in this absurd situation where I was born in South Africa but cannot get a license to operate in Starlink because I'm not black.
Well, it looks like that's about looks like that's about to change.
I just asked you a question. Please answer. Does that seem right to you?
Prof, it's because I'm not black.
Yes. Elon Musk is the epitome of white privilege run mad. There's no other way that you can explain somebody like that. He may be a brilliant tech person who has made billions, but in terms of his politics, it seems really infantile, and he's not very politically astute at all. So Elon Musk doesn't understand something as basic as 350 years of white colonial and apartheid oppression needing to be redressed. Now, there are issues with the way Black economic empowerment has been implemented, and they're both Black and white critics who have pointed out that it's a tiny group of ANC politically connected people who have tended to benefit from BEE. So one can offer a critique of BEE in terms of needing to implement it to be more broad-based, which is what the Mbeki administration started to do. But I think there's still lots of issues with it, but you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And there are also others like Max Dupree, who have written quite intelligently and talked about how the National Party also had affirmative action in the civil service for Afrikaner businesses to lift up ordinary Afrikaners. But Musk's seems to have no context of that, even though he lived in South Africa under the racist administration of John Foster, and many of his ideas were obviously shaped and formed during this period. He's completely clueless when it comes to actually having a sophisticated idea about politics, and peddling things like white genocide are just simply tendentious.
Dr. Pheko, do you think the presence of your Ruperts, your Annie Elses, and your Retief Goossens is going to help the South African delegation in the context of what we've been discussing over the past minute or so?
Those, the people, the personalities that you've mentioned, Vuyo, are certainly there for the optics, and they're there to appease this sensibility that, that South Africa is not racist in inverted commas. I mean, I have my own views about African people trying to exercise sovereignty and being called racist. That's deeply problematic. I think that the other thing is that most of these chaps, I'm not sure how in touch, especially your Ernie Els, your Gary Players, and these other characters, I'm not sure how in touch they actually are with South Africa anymore. I think people like Johan Rupert, he himself, I think, is an interesting character and has had his own runnings with the contemporary landscape of African businesses, of what it means to be a minority, a numeric minority, but I think a privileged majority. And I'm not sure whether or not they are able to really translate their own sense of privilege into a broad-based mandate, which speaks for many people in this country. I don't view them as speaking for me, per se, but I do see the utility in terms of international diplomacy and different kinds of diplomacy. I mean, we see sports diplomacy at play here, knowing that Donald Trump is a great golf. I don't know how great his golf is, but he's a great golf fan, as it were, and enjoys touring different resorts around the world. And I suppose he's threatening to turn the Gaza Strip into a golf resort as well. So that, in terms of the psychology of trying to deal with this slightly narcissistic president, is a useful technique. But I mean, I don't see these people are not politicians. I don't think that they are politically savvy. I've never heard any of them say anything that I think speaks to our political economy, that shows empathy, by the way, with the African majority in this country. I think they are there for optics, and I think we should expect nothing more from them in that regard.
Now, I mean, we've seen over, since yesterday, especially when reports emerged saying that Rupert will be part of this meeting. That was before we were told about any else and Retief Goossen as well. Now, you will know that over the years, there are politicians and political parties, but also, it must be said, within the ANC, President Cyril Ramaphosa's party itself, there have been those who have been saying that he is in the pockets of your Ruperts and white monopoly capital and the like. And interestingly, I mean, since yesterday you had the EFF, after reports emerged that a special dispensation was being looked into around Starlink, you had the EFF, among others, raising concerns over Musk's persistence to enter the South African economy through Starlink, where in a country, as both of you have been saying, where there's supposed to be genocide unfolding. But take a listen to what the EFF had to say around this.
Why is he so interested in running Starlink in a country that he says white people are experiencing a genocide in? Because if this deal that they are said to be making with Cyril Ramaphosa and the people who have gone there to negotiate with the Trump administration to sort of reset our relations passes through, one wonders whether Elon Musk is going to continue to propagate the lie that there's a white genocide in South Africa when his company is able to operate in South Africa. If he was a true humanitarian, if he was someone who was genuinely concerned about the well-being of Afrikaners in South Africa, he would be calling for sanctions on South Africa, he'd be calling for disinvestment in South Africa, but he's running a parallel campaign to install Starlink into a country that he claims is a genocide. And so it would be interesting to hear whether the negotiations in Washington will answer that question.
Dr. Pheko, your thoughts? Dr. Pheko, I don't know if you can still hear me. Just your thoughts around what the EFF was raising there on the back of what it looks like we've lost Dr. Pheko. We'll try and re-establish that line. But Professor Adebajo, just your thoughts around what the EFF is saying there, that on the one hand, he wants money, he wants to do business in South Africa, but on the other, he's saying all these things about genocide, which he knows only too well that they aren't true.
Yeah, thanks, Vuyo. I think I've talked enough about Elon Musk, and I've made my view clear that I think politically he's not very sound. He's not a very good political analyst. I've watched a few interviews with him, and he just seems a very naive and very simplistic person with not a lot of thought or reflection or even understanding of the most basic premises of politics. So that's my view. I don't think we should waste too much. Yeah. I don't think we should waste too much time on Musk. But what I would
But do you think, though, Prof, before we move on, just for a second, if you don't mind me, pardon, do you think, though, the presence or your Ruperts and your Annie Elses and your Retief Goossens who will be in that room will be able to say, hang on, Elon, we have a country at work, yes, we have problems. Do you think they will do that? Do you think they have it in them to actually do that?
That's what I actually wanted to comment on. I actually think that it's a smart move, and it shows South Africa's diversity and, in a way, South Africa's soft power. Johan Rupert is one of South Africa's richest men, and he happens to have a long-standing and close relationship with Donald Trump. And if reports are to be believed, he was instrumental in organizing the first phone call between Donald Trump and President Cyril Ramaphosa a few weeks ago before the Ukrainian president turned up. So, and Ernie Els, the Big Easy, I think, has played golf with Donald Trump as well. If you have those kind of assets within your armory in South Africa, then there's no reason not to use them. It's some form of soft power. And as everybody has noted, Trump tends to have a very personalized view of diplomacy. You know, we've seen his relationship, for example, with the Saudi Crown Prince bin Salman. It's based very much on not just a transactional nature, but on a personal nature. I think the masterstroke also, another masterstroke, could be John Steinhuisen, because he's the agriculture minister dealing with these white farmers whom are alleged to be victims of genocide. And if you can have an Afrikaner white minister actually explaining what the realities of the situation are based on his own interaction with these farmers and his own steering of his ministry, I think that could be very powerful, you know, in terms of at least starting a discussion and trying to reset the relationship. And that's all this will be. One meeting isn't going to resolve all of these deep-seated issues, especially since some of them are not what they appear to be about. As I've said, it's basically a proxy war about Israel to some extent. But I think the South African delegation is quite balanced and thought through and could convince the lily-white US delegation, at least, that whites aren't being oppressed in South Africa.
Parting shots, Prof, do you think that the US delegation cares about how lily-white they are? And then secondly, do you not think that the may just be comebacks for President Ramaphosa once all has been said and done today for the inclusion of your Ruperts and any else's and your Retief Hussens?
Well, comebacks from whom? Who do you have in mind?
Some of the political elites within the ANC, those who have said they are opposed to white monopoly capital being in charge. Of course, other political parties like your MK parties and your EFFs.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's a very difficult tightrope that the president is trying to walk. And there won't just be pushback within the ANC to people like Johan Rupert. There will be pushback within the ANC if Elon Musk and Starlink are given an exception to invest rather than to bring in black partners in order for him to come into the market. So with a 40% vote, I think President Ramaphosa is definitely vulnerable, but it's a balancing act.
Prof, let me thank you very much for being so generous with your time. Professor Adekeye Adebajo, Senior Research Fellow at the University of Pretoria, but also Dr. Lebohang Pheko, a Senior Research Fellow at Trade Collective.